Thank you, Father Ellis. I've been billed as a novelist, which is what I am, and I've written a novel about Mendel, partly about Mendel. But what I'm going to talk about today is the strict truth. Father Ellis has already said something about Mendel being an Austrian monk or something. What I'm going to do is try and give an idea of his life and the influences that acted on him. I'm going to do all this in 45 minutes, and that's going to be a little bit of a rush, but we'll try and get through it. There he is. That's the picture that we're always familiar with that stares out of our elementary biology textbooks and things. That was taken around about 1865. It was during the period in which he was working on the Garden P. But I want to go right back. I want to try and give you some picture of who this man was and where he came from. Because he actually started out life as little more than a peasant farmer. He came from a farming background. And he was arguably Austrian. He certainly wasn't German, because he was a product of this extraordinary empire, which always seems to be under-acknowledged in history books and things like that, and in one's education. Here it is. That is the Austria-Hungary Empire as she was. This is about 1910, I think, but it gives you a good impression of the place. A most extraordinary, chaotic, marvelous collection of nations and places. And of course, some of the problems that it had continued to this day, although it has disappeared. Now, the part we're interested in is the top left. Bohemia, Moravia is marked there, and you can see the blue areas are the Czech-speaking areas. The red, or pink, German-speaking. So we've immediately got that contrast between the two languages. You'll notice below the O of Moravia, you can see Brno, which was the city associated with Mendel. That's where he did all his work, of course. That's where he lived as an adult. And you'll notice that that is actually a German-speaking island in a Czech sea. But he himself came from northern Moravia, which is there marked as Silesia. There was a Silesia one side of the Polish border and the other side. There was Polish Silesia and Austrian Silesia. And he came from the Austrian Silesia, and specifically there. If you didn't get that, it's there. It's a little place called Heinzendorf. And it still exists. And that's where he was born, 1822. And he was the son, really, of a small-holding peasant farmer. It was a humble beginning. Heinzendorf nowadays is called Hínčice. That is the Czech name for it, but it was then a completely German-speaking village. Small village, didn't even have a church. They used to go to the neighboring village to church. So it's a hamlet, really. And there it is. That was taken, a historic photograph. That was taken 20 years ago when I first visited it. And actually, the building there is the Mendel building, the Mendel home. It was in the possession of the family or descendants of the family up until the 1940s. As another view of the place, it was a simple museum, and it still is. You can actually visit. It's that building there. which you can see on the right in this. It looks different now. I looked at it on Google Earth. And they've tidied everything up, and they've got rid of all those shrubs, which seems a bit of a shame. This was 20 years ago. There are Mendel things in the village, but they come from, of course, his time when he was quite well known as the abbot, which Father Ellis has mentioned. For example, there's a building nearby at the crossroads, which you can see there, and there's a different view, a different time of year. That's the village fire station. And there is a plaque erected on the roof of it, which says that. You can just take that down in your notes. I presume I don't need to translate it. This is in memory of the outstanding naturalist and scholar of botany, Abbot Gregor Johann. He was born Johann, freeman and founder of the fire brigade in his hometown. And there's the address, Heinzendorf number 58, and his date of birth. But you see then, this was erected in 1902, and they didn't know what to call him. Because in 1902, they didn't really know why he was famous. He'd only just become famous outside the boundaries of Brno, really. So he's a naturalist and a scholar of botany by then. There are other Mendel things, Mendel relics. If you go down the road to what was Gross Petersdorf and is now Wrażnie, the neighboring village, you can find the cemetery. And I found the cemetery 20 years ago. And one of the things that struck me was that grave. Because the Russian speakers amongst you, and I assume that there are many, will be able to see that that grave is dedicated to our Soviet heroes. Because this area was liberated by the Red Army in 1945. Look at the grave to the left. The Soviet heroes are well looked after. The grave to the left is overgrown, lacks a headstone, has generally been abandoned. Go back 10 years after this photograph was taken. It was rather early in the year. The snow was still around. And there are our Soviet heroes, still there. And the grave to the left is there. And it suddenly acquired a headstone. And the headstone says, the family Sturm and Mendel. Because this has been restored in the meantime by the German inhabitants of this area who were driven out of the area in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. So even in something like the cemetery in this place, you see a lot of the history and the anguish. But in Mendel's time, this was all come. The Mendels were an established family in the area by the time the Second World War came up. Okay, so he was born in this place, in Heinzendorf, and he lived all his childhood there. His father owned a bit of land, a farmer, and Mendel went to the village school. The village school, the building still stands. It's just a sort of cottage, rather run down. The priest was an intelligent man, a highly educated man, and was a great encouragement to young Mendel. a practical man. This was a country, an area of country folk who knew about farming and agriculture. And that's the background out of which Mendel comes. He attended the village school until he was about 10 years old, and he was then transferred to a school run by a religious order. The area is, of course, Catholic, and that was the Piarist school in Leipzig, which is a town nearby. He spent 1 year there and was identified as being very promising and was encouraged to move to the Gymnasium at Troppau. Now, Troppau is modern Opava, and that's the city further to the north, just inside the present Czech border, just inside the then Austria-Hungary Empire border. A long way away, this is the high school. And Mendel was not well off. He lived on half commons. It was a long way from home. We're talking about the 1830s, and obviously transport was very limited. He had a difficult time living on his own in Troppau, but being educated to high school level. During this period, 1838, disaster. His father, Anton Mendel, was seriously injured whilst working, logging in fact, in the area near the farm, back in Heinzendorf. This was during the Robota. And this gives you an idea of the fact that we are back a long time in the past. He was working under the Robota, and that was the system whereby a peasant was obliged to work for 3 days a week for the local landlord. This was a legal obligation. It was almost serfdom, not quite as bad as Russian serfdom, but pretty near. He was logging. A log broke loose when being loaded onto a cart, and his ribs were crushed. He survived, but it seems he was largely a sort of broken man. What's going to happen to the farm? Well, the farm naturally would be going to Johann, his son. Gregor is the name that Johann Mendel assumed when he became an Augustinian. And the last thing that Mendel wanted was to become a farmer like his father. He was desperate not to. In 1840, he continued at the Gymnasium. His father struggled with the farm, and in 1841, the farm was sold. He didn't inherit his father's farm. It was sold, in fact, to the husband of his sister. There were 2 sisters. And now Mendel began to get away from the peasant life that he'd been brought up to. He continued with his education. He moved to the Philosophical Institute in Olmütz, which is another neighboring city, nearby city. And this was a preparatory program in order to enter university. But he's got a small amount of money from the farm. The farm is no longer directly in the hands of his family. It's the brother-in-laws now. He is really struggling, and he sees a way out. In 1843, he was admitted to the Augustinian convent in Brno. And this is what he said about it. He wrote a brief biography, autobiography, in 1850. And he says, therefore, after having finished he's talking about himself in the third person, after having finished his philosophical studies, he felt himself compelled to step into a station of life which would free him from the bitter struggle for existence. His circumstances determined his vocational choice. Sorry about this, Father Ellis. He requested and received, in the year 1843, admission to the Augustinian convent St. Thomas in Altbrunn, which is Brno. So actually, he joined the order in order to get out of poverty, in order to continue his education, which of course was not uncommon in those days. And that is when he moved to Brunn, as it's called in German, or Brno, as it is in Czech. Further south, to join the Augustinians. The reason why the Augustinians were chosen is probably because the headmaster of the gymnasium, I think, was an Augustinian, that he had had contact with them, obviously coming from a very devout family and environment. It was a sort of natural process, and it got him away from the farm. And there is Brno, as it was probably, I think, end of the 18th century, that picture. You can see the Spielberg castle on the hill. The modern, in inverted commas, city is the hill in the background, and this is Old Brunn. This is the old town. And the building on the left, right on the left of that, is the Abbey of St. Thomas. There's the river Svratka in the foreground. And that's what it looks like from the air, from more or less the same area, except you're now in an aircraft. Now, and you can see the castle, the Spielberg there, and down in the bottom left, I don't have a pointer, but right down the bottom left are the buildings of the convent. The city, the main part of the sort of center of the city, is to the right, as you look at it, to the right of the Spielberg castle. But you can see the city's all around, and the monastery is in amongst the buildings. That's an old print of the church. That's an old photograph of the church. That's probably late 19th century. And this one is late 20th century. And you can see some things never change. And he joined the order, and there he is, first photograph that we have. A young man, top left, he's ringed with the community, the friars. And I want to draw attention to one man in particular who is sitting, already been mentioned by Father Ellis, sitting in the front row, in the middle, with the pectoral cross, because that is Kiril Nap, who was the abbot and was a very important person in his life. There is Abbot Nap. He was a member of the Moravian Agricultural Society. He was the president of the Pomological Association, fruit trees. He was a member of the Sheep Breeding Association. What you've got to remember is what this period was like. You'd got the Industrial Revolution happening, but the Industrial Revolution only came along as long as there was an agrarian revolution, and there was an agrarian revolution. There were all sorts of things going on in the world of farming as well as in the world of manufacture. You couldn't have large urban populations of factory workers unless you could feed them. And the Augustinians owned farms in the area. And so Abbot Nap was very much conscious of modern advances in agriculture. He was also found a member of the Brno Natural History Society, and that is the society to whom Mendel read his paper. After a meeting of the Sheep Breeders Association, Abbot Nap was minuted in readings in the 1930s as saying, "Was lebt und wie." We've had a lovely discussion, he said, but the point we need is inherited and how. 1836, this is the abbot of the community which Gregor Mendel joined. He wanted to know about inheritance. What is inherited and how? How can we make better breeds of sheep? For example. So you've got that sort of background. Now, what happens to him now? He joins the order. He starts his novitiate at the Brno Theological College and the Philosophical Institute, 1844, so he's 22 years old, to 1848. He took his solemn vows in December 1846, and he was ordained priest in 1847. A sort of indecent haste about it, actually. He was made a subdeacon, then a deacon, then a priest in 3 days. Shortage of vocations. There was a shortage of priests. Might ring a few bells these days. And they then put him out to parish work. And he had a miserable time until they discovered that he was an excellent teacher. He went to teach high school level in a town to the south of Brno called, in those days, called Znaimo. And from 1849 to 1851, he taught there as a supply teacher and got great recommendations, but he has not been trained. So when he took his teaching exam, he failed it. He came back to the convent. He worked a bit more as a supply teacher at the local technical school, and Abbot Nap decided that he needed a proper education, university education, and he went to the University of Vienna. So we've come, in educational terms, we've come from a background of impoverished family in an agricultural environment, and we've actually come as far as one of the leading universities of the world. He worked at the experimental physics department, which was run by Christian Doppler, he of the Doppler effect. He got in contact with people like Franz Unger, who was an early evolutionist. This was a place that was enormously important for him. And he spent, as you can see, a couple of years there, and then came back to teach in Brno at the Realschule. And he then took his teaching exam again, as one would, because he's still not a qualified teacher. He's now done a couple of years at the university, and he failed his teaching exam again. This seems to have been a nervous disposition. He seems to have had problems with this, but he continued teaching. He never tried, so he never actually turned up for that exam, I have to say, and he became a teacher. And there he is. He's sitting down second from the right, and that is the faculty of the Realschule. It's a sort of technical school rather than the Lyceum type classical education. This school was going to teach science. The schooling was really quite rigorous and advanced. There's the building he taught in, and there it is today. The city fathers have actually turned the area in the front since that photograph into a slightly more open piazza. But you can see that it's there in the corner. That was the print, 19th century. There it is now. And to the right of it, an iconic building, which I just have to get in there, Centrum, built in 1928 as a department store. Isn't that wonderful? Here he is with the brothers, the friars, the community of Augustinians. This was around about 1860-something, a fine photograph which people are very familiar with, but look at him. He's holding a fuchsia flower, or as the English politely say, in case you get the pronunciation a bit awkward, they say fuchsia. But there he is, he's holding a fuchsia flower, which he bred. We know that. So he's already started, he's into his plant breeding. I'm briefly going to say something about the sort of environment that he's coming out of, intellectual environment. Because there were people before Mendel. He didn't come out of nowhere and start breeding peas. We've got this agrarian revolution going on, which I've already talked about. We have people like Robert Bakewell, a Leicester farmer in Britain, in England, who developed the idea of breeding in and in. Up until then, you see, you just had the cows in the area, and they sort of mate one with another, and, you know, and it's all pretty casual. And you had land races, whole areas where the cows would be all more or less the same, but there was nothing systematic about it. Robert Bakewell developed the idea of selective breeding, breeding in and in. You keep breeding in to the family so that you keep the particular characteristics you want. He did this with sheep. He did this with horses, because these were draft horses. He developed the great cart horse that was very important on farms in the 19th century, all over the world actually. And he did it with cows. He bred extensively to try and get the best characteristics. He increased animals' size, the weight of meat carried on cows, hugely by breeding. He was an immensely important person. From the academic point of view, there were people like Thomas Knight, who, not much earlier than Mendel, he actually showed dominance and recessiveness in the garden pea. And it's almost certain that Mendel knew his work, although he doesn't specifically mention him. And there was Carl Friedrich von Gärtner, who was obviously a German, and he first showed hybrid uniformity. You get two different types, you breed them together, and all the time you do that, you get more or less uniform hybrids. But if you breed amongst the hybrids, you get all sorts of parental characteristics reappearing. So these were some of the people. Gärtner is mentioned extensively by Mendel, who influenced him. And he actually offered a criticism in his paper of Gärtner's work. This is what he wrote. Statements like, some individuals showed closer resemblance to the maternal, others to the paternal type. Or, the progeny had reverted to the type of the original maternal ancestor. Are too general, Mendel said, too vague to furnish a basis for sound judgment. A decision can only be reached when new experiments are performed in which the degree of kinship between the hybrid forms and their parental species are precisely determined rather than simply estimated from general impressions. That's what he thought. And this is what happened when he started to do his work. He didn't want vague waffle. He wanted precise ideas. And in 1854, he began working with the garden pea to investigate precise characteristics. And this was the startling step that he made. The familiar characteristics, which we know from our biology textbooks. I'm not going to go into the work. You should already more or less know it. But he identified precise characteristics. He took the contrasting types, put them together as hybrids, and then self-fertilized the hybrids and got all his 3-to-1 ratios and that sort of thing. And he was counting numbers. And these characteristics were either or. They weren't perfectly either or. When is a yellow pea not a yellow pea? When does it become a green pea? There's a certain amount of fudge going on, wrinkled and smooth, certain amount of fudge going on between. That enabled him to, I nearly said to improve his results. That resulted in probably a bias within his, unintentional bias within his results. But the work began. The work began in 1856, and it began there. This is the garden of the monastery. The foundations of the greenhouse he used are there in the front of the lawn. The monastery I said monastery. The convent buildings are, he wasn't a monk, you see. The convent buildings are in the background there. And there's an aerial view, just to put it in context. The garden is to the left of the buildings that you see there. You can see the church with the grey roof. The convent buildings have red roofs, and on the left-hand side, tucked away behind the local brewery, still a brewery, excellent place. Very good, very Czech. That's the garden where his work took place. There it is on a bright sunny day more recently. And there is a photograph, precious thing, showing the greenhouse that was built by Abbot Nap for him behind the walls on the left. There's nothing there now. The greenhouse, round about 1910, I think that photograph, the greenhouse was still standing. He occupied that whole area, and the work went on for years. In 1936, R.A. Fisher estimated these numbers of plants per year. And we've got, you'll see the totals along the bottom. 2,000, 2,000, 2,000, 5,747, 6,000. He was obsessed. He was growing large, large numbers, rows and rows of these peas and counting. And it was an extraordinary piece of work. 1996, Orell's estimate is somewhat different, which means you can read through the paper and almost come up with any figure you like, except it's got to be in the thousands per year. And there you've got 2,602, 5,907, 8,630 year by year, because it's an annual plant. He was planting, counting, collecting seeds, storing them for the next year. An obsessive piece of work that went on until 1863. In 1863, on the 8th of February, 1865, on the 8th of February, and then a month later, on the 8th of March, he delivered his lecture to the Brno Natural History Society on hybridization of the garden pea. And everybody did that and asked a few questions, and that was it. Nothing much more happened. The president asked him to write this up for the proceedings of the society. We're dealing with a provincial but serious scientific society, with people who are concerned with the science that was taking place in the world at that time. It was mid-19th century. This was the time of the great 19th century scientific discoveries. We've just got evolution by natural selection out. 1859, the publication of On the Origin of Species. We've got physics being developed with Maxwell and Faraday and things like that. This is that period. And Mendel went away into the magnificent library of the Augustinian fathers. If you look at the corner there, you can pull the shelves open and you go into the stacks. And you go one step down, turn right, and in that bay, the story is, that is where Mendel used to work. I don't believe it, but it's a nice idea. He obviously worked in his abbot's, well, no, he wasn't abbot then, he worked in his room somewhere, I expect. Anyway, he produced the manuscript. There it is, picture of it. And he had 40 offprints produced. And we know where 7 of them, although I might well be corrected by André. We know where 7 of them went. He sent them out. This is my work. I want these people to read it, and I want some contact. Carl von Nägeli, the professor of botany at Munich University, went to Innsbruck, University of Innsbruck, the University of Amsterdam. That was the copy that Hugo de Vries discovered in 1900 and thought, oh, this is significant. But that was 1900. And here we are, 1866. Institute of Botany at Graz, the Library of the University of Indiana. 1 copy appeared there. I don't know how it got there. I think we probably do, but I can't remember. The Brno Natural History Society has a copy, and the Library of the Convent of St. Thomas in Brno, that's the library itself. And we don't know where any of the others went, but nobody took any notice of them. The proceedings were published in 1866. 120 copies were distributed, including to the Linnaean Society and the Royal Society in London. Mendel's paper was cited in a major book on plant hybridization by W.O. Fokker in 1881. Darwin had a copy of that, but the pages that referred to Mendel's paper were uncut. So, the great work's been produced, and nobody's taken any notice. Was there life after peas? Well, he began a correspondence with the one person who I put at the head of the list there, Carl von Nägeli, who was the professor of botany at Munich, at Munich University. He began a correspondence with this man, and he hoped to get some feedback. And had he been the right man, things might have been different. But he wasn't. Mendel was encouraged to work to try and repeat them, the experiment, on different species. He'd done it on Phaseolus, which is, I think, runner bean. He'd shown that the same sort of pattern of inheritance worked on a number of other species. And because von Nägeli was concerned with Hieracium, the knapweed, he focused on this plant. And it was a disaster. He'd lost the idea of looking for clear-cut characteristics which you could count. He was trying to cross-fertilize artificially a composite flower, which this is, which has little tiny florets. You need a magnifying glass to get in amongst them. And to cap it all, we now know that most Hieracia are apomictic. The botanists amongst you will know exactly what I mean. Apomictic means you set fruit without fertilization. So as a model plant for a genetics experiment, it's a complete disaster. In Peasant and other plant genera, I had observed only uniform hybrids and therefore expected the same in Hieracium. I must admit to you, honored friend, how greatly I was deceived in this respect, he says in one of his letters to von Nägeli. And it came to nothing. It petered out, the work. He did other things. He reared bees, was a great beekeeper. This is a now quite old photograph of the bee house that was built by him behind the abbey buildings. He collected meteorological records. It gives you some idea of the systematic nature of this guy. Look at that. That's handwritten records of temperature and humidity and things day by day. He had a meteorological station. He plotted the graphs. He had a telescope which he observed sunspots with. And he tried, we think, to relate sunspot activity to weather. So all the time this mind is going on. This mind is working, but he's lost the genetics bit. He also was a considerable microscopist. He observed single pollen grain fertilization in order to demonstrate that you only needed one pollen grain to fertilize an ovule. This was not definitely known at his time. And he kept looking at the pea work. This is one of the few bits of paper we have from the mid-1870s, the Notizblatt, showing his desperately trying to sort out ratios and numbers with some of the plants that he'd bred, even in the 1870s. But in 1868, he became abbot. And that really took over his life. Battles with the taxman over the taxation of the convent. He also became progressively ill. There he is in 1882. The work on the hawkweed faded into nothing. Despite my best intentions, I was unable to keep my promise given last spring. The Hieracia have withered again without my being able to give them more than a few hurried visits. And he was becoming progressively iller and iller. In 1879, a visitor to the convent asked him about his peas, and he said, "Oh, it's just a little trick, but there's a story connected with it that would take too long to tell." And he died, really unrecognized, January the 6th, 1884. And after his death, his books were taken and put in the library of the convent. All his notes were gathered together, piled up on the hill behind the convent, and burned. And so we have no record, original record, of the data. But he was rediscovered in 1910 and sort of became canonized almost. And there he is, the photograph of the statue erected in 1910 in the convent garden. Okay, I'm being facetious there, St. Gregor, but he's a sort of, has that sort of feel in the world of biology. Thank you.